Oh, hello, everyone. My name is David Ng, and my co-organizer that I am here with today is Alejandra Gaviria. We are both PhD students at the Social Justice Institute at UBC, and we are delighted to be welcoming you all here today to the 2022 Art, Memory, Justice Symposium, Resilient Cartographies, Everyday Strategies of Social Justice that Reemerged During Pandemic Times. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that Alejandra and I are virtually hosting this panel from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. A core part of our work as social justice scholars and the foundation of the symposium centers around decolonization. And with this land acknowledgement and affirmation that decolonization includes, but is not limited to, the return of stolen land, restitution, reparations, and justice for past and ongoing colonial subjugation. As students who work, live, and benefit from these unceded territories, it is necessary for us to start our conversation recognizing and working in solidarity with ongoing Indigenous struggles for sovereignty. This symposium grows from organizing and conversations that began in the early days of the pandemic, out of a desire to respond to and organize around the ongoing injustices that were brought to the surface from COVID-19. We witnessed the biopolitical and sociopolitical impacts of quarantine on those most marginalized: gender, race, sexuality, and ability, and the geopolitical implications of neoliberalism that exacerbated colonial necropolitics. Yet at the same time, we witnessed social movements galvanizing worldwide. Movements to topple colonial monuments, land back, Black Lives Matter, Safe Supply, and many others. Resilient cartographies came out of this energy, thinking through the everyday acts of resistance, resilience, and social justice that have emerged during pandemic times.
Hello, everyone. As David mentioned, our core inquiry that underpins this symposium is how people have continued to think and work collectively for social justice in a context where governments implemented physical isolation to address the pandemic. Stay safe, stay at home was a popular slogan that people from different parts of the world followed. But this is a phrase that presupposes several things: that we all have a house, that home means a safe place for all of us, that we can all guarantee daily sustenance without having to leave our homes to work. It also implies that all of us are self-sufficient beings who do not require the help or support from others to fulfill everyday survival tasks and to live with dignity. We ask, in that context, what is the role of the work that we do? What is the place of the care, memory, and artwork in the everyday of the pandemic? It was this question that led us to structure this symposium around three main themes: the impossibilities of self-isolation, everyday practice of collective care during pandemic times, ongoing capitalist logics of essential during the pandemic is our second topic. And the third, the colonizing sense of justice and normality in pandemic times. We were sure that other people and collective initiatives from around the world had the same disturbing questions. In our own communities, we have witnessed a wide breadth of organizing, including strategies of care, protest and resistance movements, and methods of coping with the pandemic that fundamentally involved complexifying and challenging hegemonic discourses of neoliberal and capitalist individualization. It is from this energy and desire for envisioning just futures that we want to deepen our reflections and questions to confront isolation, to create a space, to dialogue, and to inspire each other through hearing and experiencing this diverse initiative that works in the intersections of art, activism, and collectively during the COVID-19. We want to remind you that you can visit the website resilientcartographies.com, where you can find all the gestures that have been contributed for today's symposium. The link is being dropped in the chat right now. We want to say thank you to Diego Cruz for designing our website and to Shira Anisman for the illustration design of our poster. We also want to thank the organizing committee students, Anyushka and Elul, for collaborating with us and doing this kind of collective organizing during pandemic times. This symposium is supported by the Transformative Memory Network, UBC Research Excellence Cluster, and Social Justice Institute Memory and Justice Research Stream. We want to especially thank to Dr. Pilar Riaño Alcalá and Dr. Erin Baines for their support and feedback during the process, as well as Nila Yutami for the communication and outreach support. Okay, now to our opening panel, the impossibilities of self-isolation, everyday practice of collective care during pandemic times. The enforcement of quarantine on communities all over the world has also brought to the surface already existing inequalities. Those who have the ability to quarantine and work from home disproportionately occupy space of privilege. Disabled people, working class communities, poor communities with unstable, dense housing or informal jobs that depends on everyday go out to search for something, do not have the option of quarantine. What has been the response to this? How was quarantine being experienced differently by communities with different life experience at the intersections of class, geography, and ableism?
Thank you, Alejandra. And it is our great pleasure to introduce our panelists and moderator for our first panel. So our moderator is Dr. Fuyubi Nakamura. Fuyubi Nakamura is a sociocultural anthropologist trained at Oxford. Dr. Nakamura is cross-appointed as assistant professor in the Department of Asian Studies and as curator Asia in the Museum of Anthropology at UBC. She is also associate member in the Department of Anthropology. She taught at the Australian National University and the University of Tokyo and curated exhibitions internationally prior to joining UBC in 2014. Her research through exhibition curation as public scholarship includes Traces of Words, Art and Calligraphy from Asia 2017, and A Future for Memory, Art and Life After the Great East Japan Earthquake 2021. Among her publications are Asia Through Art and Anthropology, Cultural Translation Across Borders 2013, and Hokkaido 150, Settler Colonialism and Indigeneity in Modern Japan and Beyond 2019. So welcome, Dr. Fuyubi Nakamura. And our panelists for panel number one are from the Long Time No See Collective. Long Time No See is a collective of artists and activists that do work in Toronto's Chinatown. Amy Shuang Wang is a first-generation Chinese immigrant who lives, works, and studies Kung Fu in Spadina, Chinatown. Brenda Joy Lem is a third-generation Chinese Canadian born in Toronto who gardens, cooks, reads a lot of books, and makes art and music. We also have Gabriel Hussein Khan, they, them. Their project is CoLab, which is an art-based creative resistance laboratory at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. We also wanted to mention Alan Baylosis, who was going to participate in this panel but had an emergency and he had to withdraw from the panel. However, his gesture, Piglas, is on our website at resilientcartographies.com, where you can find all the other gestures that contributed to this symposium as well. So thank you and welcome to our panelists.
Thank you for introduction, David. Okay, so good morning, everyone. And as was just introduced, my name is Fuyubi Nakamura, and it's my honor to be moderating this first panel to kick off the symposium today. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the UBC's Point Grey campus is located on the traditional and ancestral and unsaid territory of Hankaminam-speaking masculine First Nation. I'm very grateful that they allow us to be on their land. So as Alejandra just introduced our first panel entitled The Impossibility of Self-Isolation, Everyday Practice of Collective Care explores, with three panelists explore the what enforcement of quarantine on communities across the world has exposed and various responses that came out of that. So after the three panelists have presented, we will have a conversation among the panelists first before we open up for questions from the audience. But those in the audience, you are welcome to start posting your questions or comments using the chat function as we go along. So as David just said, unfortunately, our first panelist listed on the program, Alan Belosis, is not able to join us today, but I still briefly like to introduce him and his work. He's currently a graduate student at UBC in the Social Justice Institute, and is also an emerging playwright. He's now looking to explore the intersection of performance studies, migration, and cultural memory as he locates himself immersing in the field of critical Philippine studies. His presentation, Say Hey, Stop Asian Hate, it's about a song he curated after attending the protest rally in New Jersey State in the States. A song he curated name is Pigless, To Be Freed from Hold. It's as introduced, is available on the symposium website. This song represents his critical and creative reflection of this protest in solidarity with anti-Asian violence during the global pandemic. He says, quote, as people call for justice, one must fight for it and realize that one is not alone in this fight. I want this song to serve as a tribute to the victims of Asian hate crimes, which allowed during the global 19 pandemic. He considers his presentation as meditation while he was exposed to the emerging forms of oppression and violence. Ultimately, he treats this reflection as his guide to which direction his past as a performance scholar would go to help those in need by making and implementing active campaigns through research and performance to shed light on the stories and struggles of immigrants, especially Filipinos in diaspora. So I do encourage you to check his gestures on the symposium website. So now I'd like to introduce our next panel with two panelists, and Amy and Brenda. So they will talk about the community project, Long Time No See, or I don't know whether I can pronounce it right, Mo Ging Ho Noi. Without further ado, please take it from here, Amy and Brenda.
Hi. Amy's going to put some imagery up for you to see some of the posters that were produced as part of Long Time No See. I'll share a little bit about how the project came to be. And I guess first I also just want to thank David for inviting us to be a part of this wonderful conference. So Amy, you can interject anytime. So we were looking at Chinatown and feeling like it was having kind of a triple threat with the pandemic affecting Chinatown business, where it was sort of like a ghost town. You know, people were sheltering in place, and then the businesses were really suffering. But then also the rise in anti-Asian violence and anti-Chinese violence, because people were saying that the virus came from China. And thirdly, Chinatown is really being hit by a lot of developments which are not sensitive to the culture of Chinatown. So we were trying to think of how we could support Chinatown, and one of the things, I guess, because people were all wearing masks at the time, we were thinking, oh, if there was a way we could see each other's faces even, it would be kind of like a reminder, that we're here. And I guess the title Long Time No See, or Mogen Honoi, came from like myself reminiscing about going to Chinatown with my mother when I was a child. And my mother had just passed like within the past year, so it's sort of poignant for me, like to try to, this project is sort of, she died during the pandemic, but not because of the pandemic, well, partly I guess, but not directly. So I just thought of when we were young, when I was young, or she was young then too, I guess, in the early 60s, we would, be going to Chinatown, and because of her experience of being a refugee in China, like even though she was Canadian born, she went as a child to China and then was there during the war and on the run for many years. So when she came back to Canada, Chinatown was a really important place for her because we were living in a white suburb and there was no Chinese people around us. And so for her to be able to go to Chinatown and not just see Chinese faces and have people speak the language, but actually have people that could understand what she had lived through was like so important for her psychologically. Like I think she had so many struggles in Canada, but that really helped a lot. And I feel like Chinatown has always been a place, not just for Chinese, but also other new immigrant communities and also outsiders that, people considered outsiders. Like in the early Chinatown, there was always, places where gay and lesbians hung out, and streetwalkers and low income, street people could just even get a cheap cup of tea and a place to sit down, and the Chinese cafes wouldn't kick you out, or as you would get in one of the more mainstream places. So some of those values we felt were really important and trying to find ways to support Chinatown so that they could continue. I guess another aspect was during the first wave of the pandemic, in Ontario, more than 80% of all the COVID-related deaths were in seniors' homes. So just recognizing how much, how seniors were being impacted, we also did a project called Chinatown the Best, working with seniors in our community. And I guess it was also inspired also by Friends of Chinatown, who do incredible work in Toronto. They really did so much work in order to get vaccine clinics in Chinatown, and have also been doing work with getting food to people that are having difficulty making ends meet. So part of the impetus of doing this work in Chinatown is to also help develop a sense of community so that people will galvanize together when we need to protest together, because we know there's a lot of struggle still coming with developments and things like that. I think I might have gotten a little meandering. Do you want to jump in, Amy? And
yeah, sure. So I think that for me as a project member, our collective is actually 11 people, which is pretty large for an art collective. But I think everyone, there's a mix of like younger and older activists and artists and community members. And so I think it's been a really enriching experience for us, as well as being able to connect with the wider Chinatown community. Like Brenda said, a lot of the initial project that we did last year kind of originated with this idea of joining together and being able to see each other in person. And a lot of our collective, a big emphasis is on in-person projects and things that take up physical space, because I think that it is really important for people who care and also members of the community to be seen in that space. A lot of us who are, younger, more educated, and I'm pointing to myself, I have, taken for granted access to things like Wi-Fi and our smartphones. We don't tend to, or at least I didn't before doing this project, tend to think about the people who, their only connection to their community and their world is through space and through being able to occupy space. And perhaps, and I'm thinking about, now that we've done these two projects, seniors who don't necessarily, access the internet, and people who really their social circle is the group that they meet every Sunday in the park. And the pandemic has really taken that away from them. And so our hope, at least one of the things that was really important to us in showing sort of people's faces and their stories occupying that space, is to in a way bridge that physical connection, even though we are unable to meet face to face and see each other's faces with the masks and everything. And I think that a lot of us who are, again, younger, are more technologically inclined, have found ways to connect digitally. And it's hard to remember sometimes that that's not possible for everyone. And so to be able to create like things that are in the community that are able to foster some of that connection is one of the strategies that I think is really important to us to maintain that community sense during the pandemic. Although we did use like a lot of digital methods to connect to people through this. And so as we're sort of occupying more and more space in this community and connecting with more and more people, the hope is to continue to do this work, focusing on that physical space.
Maybe we can look at a couple posters here, because I guess so long time no see. We put out a call and just said to people, can you send a photo, a selfie of yourself at a place in Chinatown that is meaningful to you, and give us a few words to explain why. So these are a couple samples of posters that we received, and I think we were quite surprised at how moving a lot of the submissions were. People spoke of like the content, like, well, even like here's someone who we often would see on the street panhandling, and he just talked about how Chinatown was a really friendly place. Like he really enjoyed being in Chinatown. And then on the right we have Hua, who often has had a few posters sharing historical stories, family stories of experiencing bullying as a child, or the head tax, how it affected his family, different aspects of Chinese Canadian history through his own personal stories. And we found that these stories, or not, on the left here, this woman, she talked about being Jewish and growing up in that Chinatown area when it was more Jewish, and then how it still has a lot of meaning to her now that it has like Chinatown, but it still has and then these two seniors on the right, or from the community center that we later spent quite a few months working with for the second project. But we found that people that didn't know a lot of history of Chinatown and how the clan associations like took up the work that I guess we consider community centers doing now, but in that time when people couldn't get loans, it was the clan associations that supported people so that they could survive or get their businesses going, and how the community centers offered spaces where people could get support for language or how to survive. And so I think new immigrants that came to Chinatown had a new perspective after they just spent time with the posters and wanted to know more. That was really, yeah. And then the other thing is the behind the people that didn't submit posters, like people that we talked to that were store owners. Some of them like, oh, no, I'm too shy, I don't want a photo taken. But then they would tell us all the issues that they were having and their concerns about Chinatown. Like many stores were having a lot more issues of being, people robbing them since the pandemic, or issues of people coming in and saying racist things to them. And I felt like it was really an important role for us just to even be a place that would listen and take their stories seriously and say, oh, this is what we need to hear, and this is part of what we want to, be aware of as we're doing this work in community. So I think it, even the people that we don't see, there was still like an impact of the project, but the people that didn't submit.
Brenda, do you want to talk about how the envisioning sessions went as well as a result of that project?
Yeah, so then the second project is called Chinatown the Best, and we spent quite a few months going to Chinatown with seniors. We would have tea and walk around, talk about different places, that had historical meaning, but also personal meaning for different people would share. And the idea was that we wanted to make Chinatown, like for the seniors to be able to envision what would make Chinatown the best for them, what kind of services they needed, or what kind of environment would make it the best for them. So these are portraits of seniors for the second project, Chinatown the Best. They're full-bodied images that were posted. They're pretty close to life size. And we like the feeling that we're kind of claiming what is considered like, public space in Chinatown, but really claiming it as our space, and that space becomes almost like a living room that we have photos of our aunties and uncles, like they feel like our aunties and uncles in there, and have had people talk about like how comforting it is for them to see these people, the city's peopled with these photos. And I think of bell hooks talking about how like your own living room is a site of resistance because you can put up photos that represent your people the way they are, not like the garish stereotypes that we normally see in society. And I think in this way, we're kind of reclaim Chinatown streets as our living room and put up photos that people from the community have put up of themselves to represent themselves. And so in terms of the pandemic, we feel like it's helping to create greater, like making it things more conscious that were unconscious, and also create a greater sense of community so that we can work together. And because people don't realize like people in Chinatown is such a broad, so many cultures, like not even including all the other ethnicities of people living in and working or being in the Chinatown area, but in the Chinese alone, like the country that people come, like all different provinces speak different languages, have very different cultures, and we come at different times. Like if you came, before the Cultural Revolution, or if you came before Tiananmen Square or after, like it's all different cultures. And so we're finding ways just to get to know each other and kind of build community.
Yeah, and just another point about this last project, I think one of the goals of this one was to show seniors as, in their best as they defined it, to be able to show them as sort of a lively group that can, fight or do all of these things. One of our common sites is the Hong Kung Fu Club, which is where I'm a student, but also there are a lot of people who are active who are seniors. And so it was really wonderful to be able to show that side of people in our community that others might not think about. And for me personally, the intergenerational relationships that I've been able to form with people have been really valuable. And just being able to see sort of like a future where, in the middle of a pandemic, sometimes it's very hard to. I think that's it for this. I think we're running out of time, so I'll hand it right back.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy and Brenda. That was really wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. I want to learn more about it, maybe during our conversation later. So now I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Gabriel Hussein Khan, joining us from Bogota, Colombia. He works at the Office for Inclusivity and Change at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And today's presentation is entitled Struggling for Equality, and he will talk about the Creative Change Laboratory initiative at the University of Cape Town. So please start, Gabriel, for your presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. It's so great to connect with all of you. To start, I thought I'd just introduce myself. My name is Gabriel. I come from Johannesburg, South Africa. I identify as queer and Muslim, and need to acknowledge that so much of my life, unfortunately, has been shaped by the heritage of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa and beyond. The only reason my ancestors got to come to South Africa is because of the indentured labor system, where persons from South Asia were brought to work on sugarcane plantations in KwaZulu-Natal. The only reason I speak the language that I do with this presentation, English, is because of that colonial history. And so much of that experience is part of my lived experience, at least. As was mentioned, I'm currently based at the University of Cape Town at the Office for Inclusivity and Change, and I focus on inclusivity, capacity building, What that means is I support departments and faculties at the university to analyze inequality and oppression, to develop actions which respond to them, and to try and collaboratively research those interventions to test their efficacy and effectiveness. And I'm really happy to be joined to join you I'm in a different time zone, so I'm going to say afternoon, this afternoon, to think about how zine making can be used as a way to, create spaces for support and collaboration, and to connect with each other. And I'm going to be using the zine I'm projecting on the screen to talk through some of these themes. And just to say that the zine I'm sharing is a way for me to include some of my project collaborators in this presentation. So while I'm talking, and my talking is probably going to be boring, you'll see their amazing images on the screen as a way of connecting with their stories and connecting with their narratives. And so in putting this presentation together and thinking about the latest zine we worked on called Another World, Queer, Decolonial, Feminist and Anti-Racist Dreams for Higher Education, I was really inspired by the words of Arundhati Roy, who says, "Another world is not only possible, she's on her way, and on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." And I'm really inspired to think about how in the moment that we're in, we can almost hear, if we find a quiet space in the crazy and violent world that we inhabit, the opportunities, the dreams of another context. So I'm quickly going to go to the next zine page as I start. And so I wanted to start by talking a little bit about this restless context that we inhabit. So much of oppression in the world is seen as, an unquestionable or necessary part of our existence, of higher education. At the university that I'm from, the University of Cape Town, economic inequality limiting access to and completion of education, homophobia and transphobia, racism and sexual and gender-based violence is well documented. And as people of color, as queer and trans people, as women, indigenous people, and as migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, we're taught to accept the violence that we experience in higher education, to accept our position on the margins of discourse, and to behave and be respectable. That's the kind of expectations projected onto us. And sorry, let me go to the next one. And we as young and oppressed people on the sidelines of South Africa and of higher education, we still have many struggles, and these struggles were here even before COVID and were exacerbated by the COVID context. We still don't own land in geographies we call our home. We struggle financially and aren't heard in political, social, and economic spaces. On one hand, the experience of young and oppressed people is framed by state institutions which gaslight us in speeches and statements. For example, limiting our democratic participation to the act of voting instead of connecting and collaborating with young people as experts on their own experiences and change agents in their own communities. And on the other hand, we inhabit a global context marked by conflict and war that I think is affecting many of us at this moment, a dire climate crisis, and a conservative push against progressive changes related to gender, sexuality, and race. And it is in this context that young people are seen as products of culture rather than the makers, creators, and dreamers that we are. Yeah, and I think that as young people in this context, we on one hand are framed by these colonial, heteropatriarchal, and cisnormative structures of power. But I don't want this to be a sad story, because it's not. Because I think on the flip side, we as young people, as people who are experiencing oppression, find ways to reimagine, regenerate, and resist these structures. And just with a couple of images I've hopefully flashed on your screen, you'll get to see that resistance coming through quite strongly. And today I'm going to be introducing and talking about Transform Lab, a project of the Creative Change Laboratory, and the zine you see up on your screen, which emerged. And I invite you to see this creative intervention in opposition to and in response to and as a healing balm in protection from the violence that is so present in the world that we inhabit. Yeah. And I thought I'd just say those words in introduction to the project. And I thought I'd start by just talking you through some of the theoretical and methodological roots of the project very quickly. So in an unkind world, there's healing power in creating affirming and safe spaces for those who are marginalized or oppressed by the society that we inhabit. And this focus on healing acknowledges that collective and individual resistance to oppression can be empowering and therapeutic in itself. And this practice of resistance as well can propose how we can transform these oppressive structures in the spaces we inhabit. And through this resistance, networks can emerge which encourage collective healing and care and solidarity and radical love as a healing, albeit temporary, response to the feelings of alienation and exclusion. And I think temporary is an unfortunate, an important thing to mention, just because projects like this have limited budgets and timelines, and so they're never permanent, but they allow us to dream about what an alternative world might look like. And so what you see projected on the screen is actually an outcome of many years of work in Southern Africa. So Transform Lab, the intervention I'm talking about today, is a direct offshoot of the Creative Change Laboratory, which is a bigger project that experimented with using long-term participatory interventions, confronting intersecting social themes, so talking collectively about race, gender, sexuality, etc., and using multiple art forms, so using visual art, drama, creative writing, etc. And Transform Lab, the zine you see up on the screen, was adapted this methodology, this historic work, for use in the COVID-19 context, with sessions being held online and participants joining in from their homes. So usually when we do an art intervention, we meet at a workshop space over a period of time, and physical interactions are so important. And this was the first time we experimented with doing this kind of online. And the idea was this work is aimed at not only using creative or art methods, but using those to build community and generate activist responses to inequality, some of which you'll see as I go through the presentation. And it's about thinking about how art can be used for healing and solidarity, and how art making itself, the action, can become a catalyst for generating inclusion. I think what's key is that creative and art-based methods challenge us to think outside and beyond that which is seen as unquestionable or necessary parts of ourselves and the world. It invites us to dream about alternatives and to share our dreams in a different kind of language and format. Beyond serving a technical or operational purpose, like a report or a policy brief might serve an operational purpose, it offers us something different. Rather than a black text on white paper colonial way of producing knowledge, it offers alternatives through handwriting, sketches, and unconventional ideas. And I think this is part of what allows us to evade the rigid silencing grammar of colonial ways of being in higher education. And I think this is very nicely represented in Andile's image that you see up on the screen. Which captures some of this energy and emotion, and how it can be used for kind of collective healing. I think in Andile's image, the suggestion about having a voice and being able to speak one's home language at a university can be liberating. So thinking about how even the ways we speak or connect can sometimes limit us as well. And so the next step I'm going to take you through is just the who, what, where, why of this project, so you can get an understanding of how it was actually implemented. So when you ask yourself, what is Transform Lab? It was imagined as a creative laboratory space for transformation agents in higher education. And so I use the word transformation agent to refer to anyone interested in transformation, diversity, and inclusion within the higher education space. Not only those working in a professional kind of capacity, but those who are interested, activists, etc. Participants in the project joined 12 online workshop spaces where we used art to respond to the world we inhabit. Each session was about 3 hours long, and we also connected asynchronously and completed a few asynchronous tasks. And it culminated in the development of the zine you see up on your screen. And so Transform Lab had 3 blocks. We started with what we called co-think, where we collectively identified problems and challenges. The second block was called co-create, where we collaboratively developed creative solutions and responses. And the last block was called co-curate, where we jointly curated our solutions for access to a wider audience. And so the zine you see would be the curated solution that we developed. In creating a space like this in South Africa, we had to also acknowledge how we live in a context with huge disparities in terms of access to resources and technologies. And COVID-19, in fact, exacerbated this inequality. And so we really needed to think about how participants could meaningfully join from their homes. And we tried to respond to the issues using 2 solutions. Firstly, delivering creative laboratory equipment to people's homes so that they could fully participate. And the equipment box included all the materials they needed for the workshops, but also additional materials to kind of spark the creative process. And also, each participant was given a stipend of 156 Rand as a way of making sure they could cover data or incidental costs. So South African rands, I haven't used I haven't changed it to the currency in context. I don't know how much that would be, but it was an acknowledgement of how expensive data is in the South African context. Yeah. When it comes to why this approach, I think the key thing is that we wanted to offer a space for radical, creative, and decolonial dreaming in response to the racist, capitalist, colonial, and heteropatriarchal higher education environment we inhabit in South Africa. And in institutions where structural constraints and individual resistance to transformational change is present, Transform Lab aimed to ask what comes after the current transformation status quo. So what comes after this the status quo that we're in? Can we imagine something that might be different or alternatives? And in doing so, we aim to do things differently with the project, with the hope that this would lead to different kinds of dreams, some of which I'll share as we go through this. In terms of when and where the project was held, it was between September and December 2021, and CoLab obviously goes back until 2019. With synchronous sessions being held weekly, with a break in between each of those 3 blocks that I mentioned. And so we used Facebook groups and Microsoft Teams as a way of connecting synchronously for workshops, but we also used the Facebook group and WhatsApp to connect more socially and debate and share art more informally as well. In terms of the how, the idea was that participants would join online sessions each week where we would sketch and draw and paint and collage to co-create kind of our analysis of transformation, diversity and inclusion kind of challenges and develop our creative responses. And we used a participant-led methodology inspired by Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal. And in doing so, the workshop was facilitated in a manner which foregrounded the lived experiences of those who participated, rather than inserting theoretical concepts. Yeah, it aimed to neutralize hierarchies of power by acknowledging how race, gender, and class, even in groups of us experiencing inequality, can create hierarchies. Yeah, and try to enable those who participated to lead the direction of the process, including the development of the zine that you see. And I think in creating a process like this, it's important for me to make a comment about the ethical elements. And I think I just want to cover those very, very quickly. I think that often in higher education, we talk about generic ethical requirements, such as informed consent, etc., which is all very important, and confidentiality, etc. But I think it was important in a project like this to also respond to social justice ethics, so the social justice needs. And I wanted to focus on those instead of the generic steps, which we obviously had to cover to run a project like this. I think the first thing was it was important to foreground and affirm the healing aspects of this process, rather than any research or knowledge dissemination goals. Primarily, this was a space for us to connect and build community, and anything else that emerged was incidental. And this was about prioritizing the needs of those of us who participated. I think the second thing was about making sure that the process was about enabling and amplifying the voice of those who've been historically excluded from these institutional conversations on transformation, diversity, and inclusion. And so it was about ignoring, in a way, institutional transformation agendas and centering the voices and the visions of those who participated. It was also about encouraging the agency of those who participated in terms of how we shaped the zine that you see up on the screen. What was the tone we used, which audiences we wanted to disseminate it to. It was really about centering their vision in producing it. Yeah, and so I'm hoping you're getting to see how we framed and located it in this process. And I think the last thing I would mention is, who did we work with? Who were the transformers on this project? Initially, we targeted transformation agents from universities in the Western Cape province of South Africa, but we actually got interest from across the country, and so ended up including people from other regions. We specifically targeted people already interested in transformation, diversity, and inclusion in their personal or professional capacity. And we didn't only focus on people at universities, but communities and community-based organizations doing work in this area already. And we aim to collaborate with those who are on the margins of higher education in South Africa. So specifically focusing on folks of color, women and gender non-conforming persons, queer and trans persons, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers and persons with disability. And this was in response to that context I mapped out at the beginning, where we really wanted to center those who've been historically excluded from these spaces within the university. And so in closing, I thought I'd say just a couple of things about how we can make sense of this work. I think in this restless context where UCT and other higher education institutions are burdened by racism, sexual and gender-based violence, colonial ways of being and doing, and other examples of inequality, violence, and discrimination, Transform Lab can be seen as a small and tactical response to this context. In shaping and developing Transform Lab, it wasn't intended to replace existing programs in place or to produce recommendations or to fulfill another operational purpose. Instead, it was imagined as an alternate and complementary and temporary space rooted in the principles of collaboration, critical and creative reflection and learning, and most importantly, dreaming, which is the last point I'm hoping I can focus on, the idea of dreaming. I think that rather than focusing on, transforming spaces as an operational programmatic intervention, which ends up invisibilizing, surveilling, coding, and quantifying those who exist on the margins of higher education, it instead focused on the potential of imagining alternatives. And these alternatives emerge from stitching or weaving together indigenous and subaltern systems of knowledge, and social justice approaches, including focusing on, being culturally inclusive and anti-racist in this space. And the act of weaving acknowledges the not-so-tension points, but appreciates these not-so-tension points, make the overall tapestry or dream stronger. And in a way, it's not about avoiding tensions when we talk about our intersecting struggles, but focusing on how these can lead us to new conversations about our shared, our shared struggles for justice. And the idea is to lead to new visions for higher education, but also new practices that are affirming rather than oppressive. And the effort to dream implies building different kinds of relationships, one which acknowledges and responds to power dynamics both within our relationships, but also within knowledge, systems of knowledge as well. And so I think it's important to think about and appreciate that element of dreaming. And the last thing I thought I'd show you as I wrap up is where these dreams can lead us. And I really appreciate this alternate vision put forward by Viwe, where Viwe shared their description for an alternate vision for a university, which centers indigenous practices. And Viwe argues that we should see a university as a place for building community knowledge, thinking about community research and learning practices. And one that connects to indigenous ways of governing spaces that really center accountability and holding those in leadership positions accountable. And so, in closing, I just want to appreciate that, talking about art and dreaming is quite difficult, and even putting this presentation together was hard for me to form the right words, because I think art and dreaming are ethereal and inconstant. If we rotate an image, it takes on new meaning, with shadows and light catching it in different ways. And so, as we dream about different ways of doing things, we also need to appreciate that creative inconstancy, because I think that's where we can focus on the hope these visions can give us. But thank you so much. I'm hoping that gave you a good kind of overview and some exciting images to get you thinking about this work. But yeah, thank you so much. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much for your thought-provoking presentation, Gabriel. I enjoyed both of your presentation. I'm sure the audience did as well. As you both kind of talked, and of course, there were and continue to be inequalities among and discrimination among particular communities regardless of pandemic. As we know, the pandemic has not only exposed but highlighted them. You have kind of creatively responded to this difficult situation in uniquely different ways. And but I think there is a common thread running through in your project. That is a sense of solidarity in delivering care work. And you have worked with some communities of people who probably could not self-isolate themselves easily during difficult, challenging times. So start of our conversation, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about how you think your project or initiative has helped those communities to cope with pandemic itself. I ask this because we tend to focus on kind of negative aspect of society during such challenging time, but I'm very curious to hear what kind of positive responses or reflections you have received to your respective project. So anyone can start.
I'll start. I guess one thing working with the seniors, at first many of them were afraid to come out, and so they were very isolated. And we were lucky because we started to meet when it was still not too cold, so we were meeting outside, and so that allowed us to meet in person. And then I think having all the posters large scale and out in public also allowed people to interact, and also because the posters are very intimate stories, allowed them to feel like they're actually, with people in a way that they haven't been. So I think that was very helpful, being able to do things outside and taking a public space.
I don't know, Amy, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think just on top of what Brenda said, but the big part of the project was sort of giving a face to the people in the community. And so in doing so, I think that it allows for more just casual connection. Like you might see someone's story when you go to the grocery store, and then you might see them out in the world. And it's somewhat comforting to know that these people are your neighbors and you can say hello to them, which, allows for a little bit more of that solidarity that I feel like we've lost in the pandemic, just being able to be in the same space as each other. So that's been really lovely. And we've heard a lot, not only for, so once the first project concluded, we did start to share some of the stories on Instagram just because of access, and the exhibition itself was only up for a temporary time. So we've gotten a lot of really positive feedback there as well, in terms of things that people didn't know about the space or people that they recognized. And it's just been really lovely to hear about these connections as well, and people visiting the sites as well. So it's been really, really great.
I think another aspect is that because we really wanted to reach like working people in Chinatown that like some of them might be working 7 days a week, so they didn't really have an opportunity to participate, or else they're very suspicious. And so people, after these two projects, being able to just see works on the street, I think allowed them to begin to feel some connection, even though they may have been wary to participate themselves. So for us, it's really like trying to reach people who normally might not have been engaged in the community. They may be like kind of hiding behind the corners and not feel safe. And especially people like told me like from coming from Taiwan or China, they felt like, you know, do I really want my face that big? You know, photograph it. It's like, so to create a place that feels like a safe space and to feel like, oh, like, so I think it's just, it's very, for us, it's a very like at the bottom level of just really trying to create some kind of groundswell of people opening up to each other and beginning to feel like, hey, this is a space that we can connect. And then hopefully getting to higher levels of consciousness where we can do political organizing and other things, but finding that this basic level is really important for us at this time.
Yeah, access as well, like socioeconomic access to things like art are things that, you know, some people can take for granted with, and like organizing activities as well. You know, I find things on social media, but a lot of people don't have access to that because of, you know, just inability to access technology or like through their class and, you know, technology knowledge. And so it's really difficult sometimes. And to be able to share art on a very public and accessible level is something that is really important to us and something that we'll continue to do.
It's wonderful. So, Gabriel, do you want to actually add to anything from your project?
Yeah, sure. I really identify with some of what Amy and Brenda has shared as well, and I'm going to be echoing back some of that as well, I think. I think the first thing I would share is in terms of, quarantine and social isolation during COVID-19, I also want to appreciate how individual loneliness and alienation can be seen as kind of an affective experience of violence, and we should locate this individual loneliness and alienation within a broader context of structural violence and exclusion, at least in the South African context. And so those of us who are lucky enough to have a connection to the internet at home, have devices like a smartphone or a laptop, were able to easily connect to family or friends or easily continue working. But the majority of people in the South African context don't have internet at home, might have only one device, probably a smartphone and not a laptop. And all of those play a role in how that experience of alienation or loneliness was far exacerbated, if that makes sense. And so I think it's really important to think of ways, projects like both of these this morning, who've been able to create these small and useful spaces for people to connect and represent their stories, can be empowering. And I think the question is, for me, how do we also use these really innovative interventions that have been tested in a way that can access and support more people in the future? And I think that's part of the struggle. But with that struggle comes conversations about funding and buy-in around using arts methods, which isn't always there with bigger institutions. And so there are other barriers that we'd have to try and confront, if that makes sense. But I think it's important to locate individual experiences of loneliness within that broader context of structural exclusion. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So it's kind of following on the, this part of conversation, but do you consider art or other creative expression to be an effective tool in delivering care work, or even voices in such a difficult time? Or put it differently, do you think everyday care act can be made visible through art practice? I ask this because I've been doing research on the aftermath of Great East Japan earthquake, which hit Japan 11 years ago. The image you see behind me is one of the tsunami memorial in Tohoku region in Iwate Prefecture. So I've kind of asked this question myself. So I'm very interested to hear the kind of role of art in such a difficult time. What can they actually do? I know it's a big question, but yeah, since you've been working on, doing a project, yeah, I'm very curious to hear. So Amy, do you want to start?
Yeah, I do have something to say about that, which is I think that it was difficult for me, I think, to think about art in that context, because it is work and really important work, but so much of sort of my background in the fine arts academic space has been very like barrier. It just feels like there's a lot of barriers. There's a lot of paywalls, there's galleries, there's just so many sort of difficulties in creating art, and then for what audience is always the question. So I think my involvement with Long Time No See is that it's community created art. So like we're not necessarily creating the pieces themselves, although we're facilitating and giving a medium and a theme and a topic for people to come around to create a project that is larger than any individual one person story or photo or things like that. Like we are primarily in the business of facilitation in these two projects. And I think that the act of creating art as a community is, for me, the most important and most rewarding part of this, and not necessarily the end result of like, here's a thing that we made, take a look at it. But I think a lot of the connections that have been formed are, between the groups that we've worked with and the seniors that we've spent time with in sort of drawing out their stories for the purposes of the art, the business owners that we've spoken to and built connections with to give them space to like allow us to put our art on their walls. That those have all really contributed to creating a sense of community within the people that we've touched. And so I'm hoping that that's more of like, for me at least, that's more of the work. It's not so much, the exhibition of the work, but the creation of the work itself in the community. And I really appreciated that from Gabriel, your presentation as well, and like highlighting all of the different participants in there, and seeing all of their visions, because like envisioning was also a huge part of the projects that we did, is like talking about, future and possibilities with the people that I think don't get asked that question very often. So
yeah, I could to add to that for me, like when I had this initial idea to try to bring together artists and activists of different generations that I knew, I had first been inspired by the work of Friends of Chinatown. And Friends of Chinatown is a group of young activists, and they were protesting a development in Chinatown. And I felt like when I was doing activism when I was younger in the 90s, to have older activists come and support and recognize the work would really give it a boost, because they're kind of not that well known in the community as a younger new group. And so really a big part of the initiative to get this project going was actually to support Friends of Chinatown, because they're doing the real hands-on work. They're actually getting the seniors out to be vaccinated. They're contacting people one-on-one to get them to come out. They're speaking the translated languages to do it, and they're actually the ones that are taking food to people's doors, right? So I felt like what I really wanted is to create a groundswell so that we could actually support that kind of work and recognition for that work. And art has been a really good way, because like I said, there's a lot of, even like I would say of my parents too, there's a lot of suspicion of government, like Gabriel talks about. We live in a society that has never wanted to give us a fair shake. So like my father or my uncle, they would always be like, if anyone came to them, like, don't tell them nothing, right? Because we don't trust, we don't trust government. We don't trust. So for us to try to get public art happening in Chinatown, it's a very slow kind of just building up from the bottom thing, because we come from cultures that have, don't feel safe necessarily to have our faces out there and to put our voices out there. So for us, it's like, if we can create this kind of trust amongst people who have very diverse experiences and diverse cultures, but all care about Chinatown, if we can build trust, and then we can actually do some of the more concrete things that are actually making change. But the art is really a way of humanizing and connecting, which we need before we can do the other part together.
Yeah, wonderful. Before I invite Gabriel to respond, I also like to invite audience to start posting your questions and comments for these wonderful panelists. The question would be great too, not necessarily just a question. So, because I haven't seen any coming in from the audience, so please do start posting your question and comment. So, Gabriel, would you like to also respond to what Amy and Brenda just talked?
Yeah, I think I just appreciate what both of you shared around how art as a process can be really powerful and effective. And on my side, I think the first thing I appreciate is how making art together can create that community of care and solidarity. Because making art implies we're being vulnerable, especially when introducing art to communities where they don't think that art is something that they do, or they don't own it. And then it's about appreciating that. I know in Transform Lab, one participant mentioned that they were really embarrassed to share their stick figure, but as we began unpacking it, we began appreciating that told her story though, and that's important to appreciate and acknowledge. And just the vulnerability of holding a crayon leads us to having different kinds of conversations as well. And I think in addition to that, the more we made art together in Transform Lab, the more we processed our own lived experiences, and that too is another layer of personal vulnerability in terms of the stories, often painful stories and often joyful stories that we're trying to process and appreciate. And so I think the healing and community building potential is quite powerful, and that's about using the process of art rather than the outcome of art, like the images I show. The question I'm interested in asking myself, and I don't have an answer yet, is what can the output of an art process do? So when I look at the zine, I feel that it's beautiful and interesting and inspiring, but it's hard for me to work out the impact it's having on people out there that are downloading it or accessing it. And I think this is something I'd like to explore more. What is the impact of that output? I know it's doing something to the spaces it inhabits, but I'm not sure what that is yet. And I'd love to hear if other people have ideas about the power of the output. Historically in South Africa, art was important to bring down apartheid. And art has played an important role in exhibiting their works in public spaces illegally often, such as using poster making. And I think now, only 30 years later, we can see the impact of that art. And maybe it's going to take another 30 years to see the impact of the art of this moment. I don't know. I also think it's important to ask what art can't do. And to critique the work that I do, I think the key thing that art can't do in the South African context yet is it hasn't been able to change material realities. So where we have huge disparities of economic access, an art project like Transform Lab doesn't make that go away. And this is something I'm struggling with, because I think there needs to be a connection between community building and responding to those material realities. And I'm not too sure how we do that yet, but I just wanted to mention that at the moment, the art project, at least the one I'm talking about, can't really respond or hasn't responded to those material realities. So even though people had, the stipend and the art equipment box, a couple of months later, that's gonna, run out. And so, what do people do after that time? Does that make sense? I thought I'd just highlight that limitation that's important to acknowledge as well. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I did have one thing I wanted to say about that, which is I definitely struggle with the same things about sometimes, what is the impact? And we've created this thing, what do we do with it now? Two small things that have come out of the project that we've realized is one, that the buildings in which we've installed the art during the process, or during the time when the exhibition was up, there was no vandalism at all. Which we were actually very much expecting to have to deal with because of the sort of it's just a common thing in our space and in our Chinatown. But the surprising outcome of that is that none of our posters have been maliciously defaced over the sort of almost year that we've had these two projects up, which is incredible. And then the other thing is that just how much people have stopped like observing in the space, to stop to look at it and then sort of see the actual spaces that the posters are on. And so a lot of the places that we have installed are public libraries, community centers, and things like that. And people have definitely noticed, the people who work and occupy those spaces have noticed an uptick in people engaging with their businesses, which has been, small, but really powerful for me in terms of like an actual impact that we've been able to make with these posters. And I think that, I'm a comics person as well, like, in other spaces. And so I think like zines and political minded pieces like that, like they always reach somebody. And so I think that, you're doing really great work over there. And I would really like to encourage that.
Yeah, I also love zines. And I feel like it's such an intimate thing, because they're usually something that you read in private. And so the effect is harder for you to see, but I think it's the type of thing that gets out and is very personal, the way it affects the person who reads it and who gets to hold it, if they hold it in their hand or watch it in an online, whatever. I think
It's so wonderful to hear that, because I think art can really provide opportunity for reflection, also connection, and also create a shared sense of hope. So I think that's what art can probably do. Also, as Gabriel said, we have to think what it cannot do. That's very important aspect as well. Actually, I was very curious when you talked about the art and dreaming, because I didn't think about dreaming so much. So I kind of want you to elaborate a little bit more about your idea of art and dreaming.
Yeah, I hear you, and I just want to acknowledge the comments like colleagues have shared, and I think it's quite tough. And what's great about talking about arts methods in this way is that you're able to see some things in the zine that I can't, and this is because, of course, of proximity, but also because our context inspires us to read these in different ways, and they can take on new meaning in different ways. To respond to your question around art and dreaming, dreaming is something I've been exploring more recently, and this is still new to me. And there are quite a few scholars in South and East Africa that have started to talk about the idea of decolonial dreaming, of trying to imagine a completely different context, trying to evade the kind of epistemological chains that might hold us down, and just allow us to think up crazy, unconventional ideas about the world, which remove those aspects that we think are necessary. So one aspect of dreaming might be to imagine if we allocated value in a different way to the use of money or currency. What if we valued people and their objects differently? What would that mean to the way we build our relationships and connect to each other? I want to talk more specifically in response to dreaming around gender and sexuality. So I started doing this work using body maps to explore how we as queer and trans people make sense of our genders and sexualities. And a body map is a huge body-sized image of self where we spend up to a week drawing different experiences and exploring how we made sense of self. And I found it really interesting that when we started talking about and drawing our queer and trans identities, we often represented ourselves in ways that evaded the language we use. We weren't gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans. We weren't men or women or intersex. We were actually talking about something that was unworded, unlabeled yet. And I think art allows us to dream in a way beyond the languages that kind of limit us. And I think I find the term queer very affirming. So I'm not saying, I'm not taking away from that, but I'm highlighting that I was able through the act of drawing to talk about something that was slightly beyond queer, and I don't know what to call that yet. And many of the young people were talking about their genders and sexualities in ways that went a little bit beyond the language that we use. And the words, in fact, boxed people in a way that didn't quite capture what they were referring to. And I think dreaming in higher education is about moving away from the assumption that we need a university. Maybe we need a community scholaria, as Viwe mentioned. Maybe we need a pluriversal playground. It's just about imagining what would something slightly different be. And if we can make that dream real for a moment, for the 12 workshop sessions, why can't we make it real for a year or for several years? So it just takes us to make the dream real for a short moment and capture it. And if we can do that, maybe we can imagine a really different way of being. Does that make sense?
Yeah, wonderful, Gabriel, to hear that. Actually, I want to mention, actually, at the museum of Sporology at UBC, we have body mark paintings in our collection, which are actually on display at the moment in our permanent gallery. So it's really lovely to hear that. So now we have a question from audience. So I'm going to post this from Nathan. So the question is, collaboration seems to be a theme between all of your presentation. What was the process of building those relationships for your project? I don't know, do you understand, Brenda or Amy?
Sure. I can start. The collaboration, well, really the first collaboration was long time no see. The group itself, like as Amy said, we span so many generations, like from people in 30s up to people in 70s of age. So I don't know, that's 4 generations or whatever. And also like some families have been here over 100 years and like were the first pharmacist in Chinatown or the first, and others have been like maybe first generation or their families are more recent. So for us was getting to know each other through this project and then also getting to know our community. And it's really a big part of it really is spending time. I'm amazed like with Gabriel's project that, they're spending every week together. Like for us, we were meeting with the seniors every other week or every couple of weeks and just walking around and talking, having tea and just sharing stories to get to know each other and collaborating with the community. Because the first long time no see was an open call. We ended up with over 200 posters. So it was like a dialogue, even though we didn't get to meet people, because people shared such intimate stories that people began to feel connected to one another. But I think the more long-term ties were really with spending time with people. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, not on that end, but I think that for people who are we've gotten a lot of questions about people looking for ways to start these kinds of initiatives or ways to sort of like get things off the ground. For us, for a long time no see, the first project, it was sort of a self-funded situation, whereas in the second project, we got some attention with the first project and ended up with a bit of funding, which was really nice, and we could expand our efforts. But to start, I think that a big part of it was just us reaching out to people that we knew, and I think that there was a surprising amount of support from people who could offer like various things. So we ended up being able to borrow or loan a lot of materials that we needed, which really helped us out. So I would say that a big part of it was just letting people know that you're working on the project as well, and people tend to offer their stories and their materials in lots of surprising ways.
So Gabriel, do you want to respond to this question as well?
Sure, yeah. I think that similar to echo what colleagues have shared, I think, expectation building is important at the beginning of a process in terms of building relationships, and also kind of setting behavioral standards. That sounds kind of ugly in that way. What I mean is, I don't like to use the word rules, but think about how we treat each other in a way that's respectful and dignified, and I think that's important. That being said, because we specifically tried to work from the perspective of intersecting inequalities, it meant that we had quite diverse people in the space who had quite diverse perspectives, and that obviously led to tension points that we had to continuously in the process respond to and unpack. And I think tension points is important in that tapestry building. But when a tension point comes up, it's always tough to deal with. It's never easy. So even though we had like diverse people in the space, sometimes there'd be tensions between the way we're thinking about gender and race in the South African context, or the way we would be thinking about indigenous communities and migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And it became important to try and confront these as they came up. I would say doing this online had a marked difference in terms of the kind of relationship we built as compared to when I had similar interventions in person in the past. I think that when we're in person, I noticed that the tension points would be more feisty. People could get quite angry. And in addition, it took a lot of time for us to negotiate and unpack that. When it came to online, I think that often the tension points emerged when people were chatting on WhatsApp or chatting on, using text chat rather than verbal chat. And that became a different way of negotiating the tension as compared to talking when we're in the same room, if that makes sense. And the feedback I've gotten from participants in Transform Lab is that they felt less connected online than when they've had similar interventions in person. And I don't think that's unexpected. But that's part of, I think, what we compromise when we shift to the digital space, maybe. So even though they really appreciated connecting, they were really sad that they never got to meet in person and have a coffee together, which is something we'd probably do if we were meeting in the same physical space. I think the other side of it is that we were able to work with people across the country, and usually we'd only be able to afford to bring people together in the same city. So that would be a pro, connecting with experiences really different from your own, but doing that online rather than in person. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. So, I encourage the audience to post your question or comment using chat function while they're thinking the questions. I wonder if you have questions for each other, among panelists, because you probably met for the first time today, right? And learned about the project in detail. So I'm just wondering whether you have a question for each other or comment for your project.
I could maybe jump in.
Yeah, please do, Gabriel.
Yeah, I found the posters really beautiful and really powerful. And one of my own, I've never worked with photo methods before, so I wondered if you could talk about how your thoughts are on using, photography and encouraging people to take those photos. So the photo methodology, I'd love to hear more about that. Like I said, I loved the posters; they were really beautiful.
Want to go for it? I think we were thinking in some ways like of selfies that would be an easy thing, like it's sort of, so that's part of the impetus of that. And then I think also Asian representation, like in mainstream media, like it's usually like a little colorful backdrop to some white action figure or something. Like so in order for us to be able to put like seniors and life-size vibrant color was really exciting. I think also they were really uncomfortable at first, and then it's for them to really kind of later see like what we were thinking and what it would turn out like. I think it was kind of exciting for them to realize, oh, this is kind of like how it's an art project, and it's not just like I'm being photographed and how I'm part of this whole bigger thing. But I think photography is a kind of an accessible medium for people who haven't been doing a lot of art, and it's also something that people feel. It's also kind of like how a lot of times, I guess, marginalized communities have access to do documentary work first, because it's like we have so many important kind of stories that we want to tell that are very practical as well because of our specific needs. And so I think photo is actually a nice, easy starting point to use. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the selfies were also a way to be a little bit more vulnerable and a way to be a little bit more present. I think that like a lot of what Asian representation there is out in the world, we tend to be, I think, very put together as a general sweep. But like, I think that we tend to be a lot on social media too. Like, we want to show our best face. We want to, you know, have all of this. And there's so much technology out there that facilitates sort of this filtered version of ourselves. And so to sort of give the opportunity to be in print in sort of a large form kind of changes the way that you see people, I think, especially, and a lot of the photos were street photography, or which collective members did go out and take street photography of people. So that was one aspect of it. And then also the self-submissions was another aspect of it. For us as well, like, it was interesting to see the collective members and how they approached submitting to our own project. For some people, there was a lot of vulnerability there as well, in terms of like, what face do I want to present out into the community? And personally, for me, you know, it took a lot of like, okay, what am I going to do? I have this plan, and then ultimately it was, you know what, I'm going to go get some food, and I'm going to take a photo of myself in the sunshine, and that's probably the best version of me that I can think of, which was very great and experience for me as like on the contribution side. And I saw a lot of that in our submissions, which was really great, along with like other photos and historical stuff. So it was a really cool mix. It gave a lot of freedom, I think, as a medium to be kind of experimental on that end.
That's wonderful, wonderful. So do you have question for Gabriel, Amy, or Brenda?
Brenda, did you have something? I saw you.
I guess maybe the question is, who was your kind of intended audience for the zines?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so with Transform Lab, the idea was to specifically target people who are in the higher education environment, because it focused on transformation, diversity, and inclusion within the higher education space. I would argue, though, that in terms of the way zine ended up being curated, it certainly speaks to broader challenges within education, not necessarily only higher education. And I think this is because many of the artworks highlight challenges that people would experience even in primary or secondary education, for that matter. Yeah. And I think that's what's great, and in a way, it echoes what you had shared around using, you know, photographs and selfies in terms of its accessibility, and the fact that people already kind of practice photography in a way, even if they don't see it as kind of professionalized. And I think similarly with the, you know, the artworks people created, I think many of them are really accessible in terms of the way they communicate a central theme or an emotion. And I would argue that other people could probably pick it up and take away some of that that affective energy, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Great. I think thinking about accessibility is very important in this kind of art project, I believe. So does anybody have a question from audience? Or I mean, do you still have comments or questions for each other, panelists? If you know, I speak early, but you know, we had a one less presentation for this panel today. So maybe you can just wrap up. So I'd like to thank all the panelists again for your wonderful, wonderful presentation, also conversation. And thanks so much also to all of you from the audience joining us at this panel and posting your comments and questions. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. I was really drawn to some of the so much of your work, and specifically some of the themes around discourse around space. So interrogating space and taking up space, and you know, really connected to sort of the themes of the pandemic that Alejandra and I were also thinking about, in terms of thinking about you know, the imposition of isolation. Yet at the same time, I love that quote. I think it was from Bell Hooks that I think Brenda, you mentioned, living room as a site of resistance, and thinking about the possibilities and movements that have and of transformation that have been galvanized throughout during pandemic times. I was also really drawn to art making and thinking about art making and as a form of community building, and also I think Gabriel, you mentioned creative methods as a way to for us to think outside of normative logics. Yeah, I really love that. Alejandra. Oh, Alejandra, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, everyone, for your words. Thank you, Fuyubi. I think this was a great conversation, and I really enjoyed. And I was so happy just thinking in a lot of connections between both projects. And I want to see that I can describe with your concept, Gabriel, about transform agency, that these initiatives like seek to transform agency. I think that is a key concept. And in that process of transform agency, you both of your projects prioritize the connections, prioritize the participation, prioritize the co-work, and in that way that agency is transformed. And also in that way, when you prioritize the connections between people in the communities, you are decolonizing also the dispositives of education, but also you are decolonizing these kind of stereotypes that people create, for example, about a neighborhood, about Chinatown. And and also, and and the other thing that I was thinking is that a really important layer of your work is the affects and the memory, because you can see how your formats of work, your formats of creative works can not just build in this goal of create connections, but to also connect affections, about the same place where you live or work, or about the the same experience that you live in a society, as you express about South Africa, Gabriel. And also, the last thing that I want to say about this first panel is the creativity, the recursive of your formats, because you use a non-digital format, and that makes sense because sometimes we uh, we give as reality that idea of people has access to internet. And this is one of the worst points in pandemic times, that oppression, exclusions pass for that topic, that people doesn't have that devices and electronic ways to connect. And your projects seek to connect through other creative formats, and that is great. And it's great because you can with your creative formats, people can see like a multi-layer purpose, because you're telling a history. You have an image, but you also have an object of affection. And I think that three things together, for example, in a picture that you show us, Gabriel, or in a poster that you show Brenda and Amy, creates a very potent way to connect as you want to do it. So I am so grateful that we can see all that in a very like I don't know if that is the word, but simple creative format, as a poster or as a picture. And I think that gives us a lot of things to think. Thank you so much.
Can I just quickly, comment. Yeah, thank you so much to Dave. Thanks to David and Alejandra and all the students who organized this fantastic symposium. And thank you for connecting us today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you to Gabriel, Amy, and Brenda for your presentations, and to Fuyubi for moderating this first panel. We just wanted to remind you that you can visit the website resilientcartographies.com, where you can find all of the gestures that have been contributed to today's symposium. And the link is being dropped. Elu is going to drop it into the chat right now. So we are going to take a 24-minute break and come back at 11 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Just so you know, there is a different link for the second panel. Elul is also going to drop the link in the chat right now. So yeah, we will see you all at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So that's in about 23 minutes. So thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. See you.